I'm here to tell you a little bit about the BRISS project and their usage of the core vocabularies. I have heard various people already talking about base registers, how semantics play a role in there. I heard Jens talking about the digital transformation that you get by connecting different services. The context of using these core vocabularies in the context of BRISS has been system integration. It's not about a semantics in a base model, it is about the exchange of data when we're connecting services. Before I tell you how we use that, let me tell you a little bit about the BRISS project. Yeah, BRISS stands for Business Register Interconnection Systems. Yeah, BRISS is supported by a European directive, the BRISS directive, that aims at insisting that all the member states connect their business register for the exchange of data. And the reasons for doing so are very clear. Yeah, the access to the information that sits in this business register is far more of a cross-border importance. We see companies that have branches in different member states. And if these branches for some reason change their status or a mother company closes, different business registers throughout Europe have to be updated with that information. They have to notify changes. I see in the corner TOPE, the only once principle in there. Yeah, so changes need to be notified to interested parties so that they can update their information. Yeah, so BRISS is very much about cross-border events, mergers, branch disclosures, notifications on statuses in the different changes that may happen in this business register. Yeah, so this is about exchanging information on a European scale. Let me give you some figures here. Yeah, we're talking about roughly 300 plus business registers throughout Europe that needed to be interconnected. There are currently 31 countries connected to the BRISS system. This system went live about a year ago when it came into force on the 8th of June. On a daily basis, we process over 100,000 messages. When it comes down to architecture, this was a complicated story. And let me tell you, the architecture that has been put in place has mainly been a legal discussion. Yeah, what we learn here is that although we technicians might have very good ideas how things should work, the reality is that many of these things get decided in a legal context. Yeah? So BRISS is a so-called hub-spoke architecture, where any business register exchanges information with other business registers through a central platform that we host in the European Commission. Is that a good solution? It was the compromise that was put in place. Now, let me dive in a little bit to these core vocabularies and how we have used it. Yeah, when it comes down to system integration, yeah, we need to define models. We need to find message models. Yeah? And when we invited the people to come over in order to see what data models they had in this business register, we soon realized that all of the member states have different models in place. Yeah? So to exchange data, we were really looking for a kind of a super model that we could use to define the commonalities in all of these models. And this is when we came to the core vocabularies. These core vocabularies really helped us to introduce a way of doing that. It foresees in a model that could be easily adapted. There is another important point why we looked at these core vocabularies, yeah? Because in one of the first meetings where we started talking about the practicalities of putting such a model in place, it turned out that all of the participants referred to the same elements with different types of wordings. Yeah? So if you ask me what was the real value of using these ontologies, these vocabularies, it is the fact that they brought a common language to the project. We never had a debate about how do we name a certain thing, because that's what the standard, these core vocabularies, already defined. And that allows us to really make progress. We have seen in other engagement, in other contexts, where actually the discussions on some of the very basic elements became a large part of the whole discussion of the project. And using a standard that was accepted by all of the participants really helped us to avoid those kind of debates. Other reasons why we like the core vocabularies was, it's a dream to believe that it's an exact fit. Yeah? What you need to do is to make them work in a certain context. And the way they have been defined allowed us to very easily adapt them to the specifics of the situation. Okay, what does it mean in practice? Yeah, there are a few steps in working with these core vocabularies. The first step is really define the context requirements. And I do recall actually one of the first meetings where we invited all the member states to give and come with their technical experts to define basically the data that we needed to exchange. And we had a whole panel from our side with technical experts, etc., that could help in this discussion, but it turned out these were just lawyers. Lawyers that nicely said, in our context, there is national legislation in place that doesn't allow you to exchange those type of information. And that nicely links into this EIF framework. Yeah? Integration is not a technical issue. It's an issue that on different layers has an impact. Yeah? So the definition of the data that got exchanged took quite some time to agree with that on all these member states. Once we had it, once we knew what kind of information needed to be exchanged, we started mapping to the core vocabularies. And these core vocabularies define a set of elements, but they're weak in terms of constraints, in terms of business rules. Yeah, so it's not just an identifier. An identifier, yes, that is defined, but these things have constraints. These things have limitations that we needed to agree on. Yeah, so the next step is define your business rules for any of these elements that you can agree on. And once we had done that, we actually started to develop our own vocabulary based on these core vocabularies. Yeah? So rather than using them out of the box, we adopted them, we made them fit in the context that was needed. Yeah? And once we had done that, we basically had the contract that we had put in place that allowed any of the participants to build the solutions based on these vocabularies that we had defined. What does this mean in practicals? Yeah? In the first part of defining these new vocabularies for these messages that we exchanged, we're really looking at these core data models. Yeah? And you can see that in these vocabularies we have basic components, we have aggregated components. So here we start looking for elements that we can use. Yeah? And this brought in this language that we all had agreed on. Once that was done, we are capable to define the aggregated components that would make sense in the context. Now, in the context of this BRISS, that is clearly a business register, a company. Yeah? But a company, which is nicely defined as a legal entity in this context of core vocabularies, is in fact a subset of what the core vocabulary defines. Yeah? So this is really targeted to the context in which it's used. The other thing is, you can have very nice, these entity objects like a business register, yeah? But I told you that BRISS is about an exchange of information between the business registers. So what do you do as a company? Literally nothing. You need to define the operations that basically define the messaging model that gets exchanged between these business registers. Maybe you say it's a notification on a company, a certain update, this company needs to be removed or whatsoever. Yeah, so for us it's very nice to have these core vocabularies, but what's clearly lacking is a messaging model. And I'll say you a little bit later about that. Yeah? So it's a combination of core vocabularies, entries from these vocabularies, creating your own model, your business model, and on top of that introduce a messaging model that defines the operations to exchange this information. Okay, practically speaking, if you look at these libraries that are provided, those of you who have worked with it know that these vocabularies depend on other vocabularies. In the context of BRISS, we decided to decouple the BRISS messaging model, so the vocabulary that we use from BRISS, from the actual other libraries. We wanted loose coupling in there for the very simple reason we wanted to have the full flexibility to customize them to make it fit the context. But secondly, we were not entirely sure what would happen if any of the libraries that would use would bring out a new release or a new version. Yeah? And dealing with the fact of versions, as I show you in a second, is a real complication when you work in a context where many different systems have to connect to a single environment. Okay, let's not go in detail here, yeah? But here you see some of the customizations that we're doing. We're adding constraints to the definitions that come with these libraries. And the first thought was, let's make that very specific. Let's go into low-level detail to define everything we would like to constrain in the contract that we define. That in the end was not a good idea, yeah? Because it always turns out that you need to change things later on, and rolling out a change along a project that has many players turned out to be extremely difficult. I told you one of the things that we needed to work on was a messaging model. And unfortunately, the core vocabularies don't provide support in this, and we really need that. Yeah? This messaging model is an extremely important concept for us. It very much links to the infrastructure over which this messaging model is rolled out. I see also there in the corner the Connecting European Facilities, that provide support on a message channel level that provides interoperability between the technical exchange of messages. But these message channel also introduce some concepts that you have to live with, you have to deal with. Asynchronous communication. And therefore, we need a messaging model that supports those kind of things. You cannot say, okay, I'm sending a message, I get a reply. In particular for these asynchronous models, this reply is not directly there. You maybe need to acknowledge things first. There can errors that can happen that you have to deal with. So here's really a plea, and I saw that a little bit in the presentation of Jens, that also referred that he wanted more patrons to help and support that. To do more on this definition of messaging models that allow for the exchange of information in an interoperable way. Like I said, one of the important facts is what is the layer underneath the semantic model that supports that to a large extent will drive that type of definition of these message model. Now we standardize that, so when you look at messaging model, of course, we have a semantical model around the messaging model itself that needs to deal more with just the fact of the data that is shipped. That includes security, that includes things like how can we trace messages, how can we log messages, quality is in there, etc., etc. Okay, let me give you a little bit an idea of what worked well and what didn't work well for us in this context. We are struggling tremendously with messaging versioning. It was very nice that in the first release we were capable to bring out a message model that any of the member states implemented. And as there was not a solution in place for any of the member states, when you roll this out the first time, this actually goes pretty smoothly. But when we start negotiating the second release and the information that we would like to exchange in that context, it turned out that some of the semantic models that we had put in place needed to be adopted. Changes had to be introduced. And this causes today a big problem, because how do we guarantee that all of these member states at a certain moment in time nicely implement these changes accordingly to the new specifications? So versioning there and how you roll out these versions became a very important aspect. And those who would like to know more about that, please feel free to talk to me on that. Another important point that we said, look, you should not underestimate that. When we're defining the core vocabularies, there is this message compliance. What does it mean to define business rules for the messages that you have defined? It means that for the solution to work, you must make sure that everyone that implements these solutions complies with the business rule that you rolled out. So that means testing. And that was one of the advantages of the architecture that we had put in place, that a central platform that manages the exchange between all the connected systems is the ideal place to do that testing. Rather than business registers do testing among them, the strategy that we have chosen was a central strategy whereby we, as a central point in this architecture, did the testing for them. How are we doing that? Because this is an awful lot of work. This is checking out if all the rules have been correctly implemented in any of the connected systems. Well, we're using the ISA² testbed for that, and we've asked them to support us in this effort. So what the ISA² testbed brought to this picture, a picture where you integrate systems that exchange information, is that they basically allow for a solution to test this exchange on the cloud. They provided a testbed which is used by any of the member states to run their systems against pre-configured test scenarios. So rather than us having to do over and over again a series of tests to validate that all of this is correctly implemented, today the reality is that member states themselves certify them against the specifications that have been created in order to see if they comply with the rules of the solution that they participate in. So testing, I would almost say, was a bigger effort than putting the production of the whole solution in place. Now, finally, I've put some references on there if you would like to know more about the project, if you would like to know more about the technologies, if you want to learn more about how we use the connecting facilities to basically power the solution and deal with the practical problems of standards, not only on the semantic level, but also on the technical level. Thank you.